I went off to the Peace Corps and served in Latin America, in the Dominican Republic, and then was in the National Guard and the Army Reserves. And again, watching people who with disabilities or different opportunities in nations where the opportunities medically didn't exist for so many people, and how you could grow up stigmatized in a rural mountain community of the Dominican Republic because of a disability, and what life would be like if you bore those scars, and how you were treated by a community. I believe all of us can make a difference through service and leadership. Service and leadership I'm proud to have had because I was challenged by leadership in this country at a time different than this, when leadership actually asked each and every one of us to be a part of things larger than ourselves. I authored and passed when I arrived in the Senate the Family and Medical Leave Act. I don't know if there are people in this room today who've been able to take advantage of that, but I'm prouder of this maybe than more than anything else, that 50 million Americans today don't have to choose between the job they need and the family they love when a crisis arrives in their family. That's the kind of leadership I think America needs and wants as we face these crises. And I want you to know it never would have happened, despite the 7 years and 3 presidents and 2 vetoes to make that happen. What you probably don't know is it was a mother of a severely disabled child that I met in St. Bridget's of Kildare Parish in East Haddam, Connecticut, where I live, who was the inspiration for that piece of legislation. Watching Jacinta, who happens to be born on the same day I am, May 27th, watching her grow up with the disabilities that she was born with, watching people avoid her, even touching her in church on Sunday, inspired me to do something when I learned her family was having to struggle with an income where jobs were in jeopardy at risk all the time as they tried to take care of this child of theirs. And I was determined that whatever else I could do in Congress, I was going to make a difference so that families would never have to make that choice about having to lose that job while they want to take care of a loved one. So these issues that we talk about, that you've been discussing today, that are part of this forum, are personal in a way. They reach deep into my family. They reach deep into my experience as a young adult and as a member of the United States Congress over the past quarter of a century. I haven't learned about them through a briefing book, quite candidly, or a meeting in my office, but through friends and acquaintances and families and my own sister. As you've heard, Carolyn is legally blind. A proud member, as I mentioned, of the National Federation of the Blind. She won an employment discrimination lawsuit more than a dozen years ago. I will never, ever, ever forget, as long as I live, that lawyer from Denver flying across the country on a moment's notice to walk into the school board of Hartford, Connecticut, and to say, you're not going to fire a talented, gifted teacher because she has a disability, because she's blind. She's a good teacher, and she can make a difference. And because we have advocates today, she didn't lose that job. Carolyn reminds all of us, certainly her family, that the disabled community isn't homogeneous at all, that each of us have different needs and face varying barriers to opportunity in our country. So I am so proud to stand before you today and say that I have consistently supported appropriations related to the disabled community, funding critical programs from education and employment to Social Security, housing, and transition to work programs. My sister, in many ways, the inspiration in our family, is behind another piece of legislation, which you've already mentioned here, and that is, of course, Help America Vote. I'm so proud to stand here today and tell you I worked to ensure that new voting protections for those with disabilities were included in the final legislation. By the way, I see Jim Dickinson here. Jim, I thank you. This individual here did so much. Stand up, will you? Because this guy made a difference beyond belief. And Jim and I, this is a fighter, I want to tell you. We didn't quit on this legislation. I thank you immensely for your leadership here to make a difference, to see to it that reforms in our voting process would be safer and more secure and more transparent and accessible, and balloting procedures for federal elections across our country. We were able to provide funding to enable states and localities to upgrade antiquated voting systems. And we required states to revamp registration procedures and ensure broader access, I might add, so that those with disabilities could vote privately, independently, and without discrimination. What an outrage in the 21st century that people like my sister would have to go into a voting booth and have someone assist them to cast a ballot in this day and age, under the most private and important right that we have, the right that allows us to have all these other rights. My civil rights hero, thank you, Teddy. One of my great civil rights heroes, John Lewis, called the HAVA Bill the most important voting rights law since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, I should add quickly, we all know there's more to be done with this legislation. We need to ensure vigorous enforcement of HAVA's accessibility requirements, provide a voter-verified paper ballot and record and fund innovative new electronic accessibility technologies. That's why I introduced the Voter Act, if you will, which includes these kinds of provisions. And I've made restoring the Constitution, by the way, one of the centerpieces of my campaign. I believe you can't defend America if you don't stand up and defend the Constitution of the United States, which is under assault by some of these people. That's why I'm very proud that what we did with HAVA, and after the disastrous elections of 2000, in which tens of thousands of Americans, of course, were disenfranchised, changing, I believe, the outcome of that election. HAVA said that every American, every single person in our country, should be guaranteed the right to exercise the most fundamental of all of our rights, the right to cast a ballot and to have that ballot counted. Because of that law, today no American will have their right to vote privately and independently taken away from them simply because of their disability. And I'm deeply proud of that accomplishment. But obviously there are many more bridges to cross, and we all know that. I'm proud to say that Everyday Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced by my friend Tom Harkin. I signed on as a supporter, as I said a moment ago. And despite that historic step, however, people with disabilities in our country continue to experience unemployment at a rate above the national average and as high as 70%, as I'm sure you've heard already, for people with severe disabilities in our country, in part because, of course, the courts have undermined the Americans with Disability Act. That is not my vision of America, and it's not yours. And that's why, as President of the United States, I want you to know, I would encourage public-private partnerships as they relate to recruitment, hiring, and retention of people with disabilities. I would ensure that the tax code in our country encourages employers to provide additional accommodations for disabled applicants and employees. I would strengthen the EEOC's enforcement of ADA and put people in that commission that are going to stand up and fight to see to it that this law is upheld and fought for by the people of this country. And further, I would support efforts to increase the development and access to assistive and universally designed technologies in our workforce. And I would ensure that the federal government would become a model employer, by the way, of the disabled, including the White House, including the President's office in the White House of the United States as well. Above all, I would strengthen the ADA by signing the ADA Restoration Act into law. This is a bill whose time has come, and I congratulate Tom Harkin, and again, I'm delighted to be a co-sponsor with him of that legislation. Another very important issue is affordable, accessible transportation for people with disabilities, especially in rural areas. It is an issue of fairness and necessity, and people in this state, I think, can understand it. Indeed, one of the key points of my energy plan is to increase access to affordable and convenient mass transit systems that are fully accessible to people with disabilities across all regions of our country. Mass transit that is cheaper to operate because the fuel is grown here at home, not imported from some of the most dangerous areas around the globe. We all know mass transit saves, of course, a family's money and fuel costs and lowers pollution problems by reducing the number of automobiles on our roads during rush hours. We all know that affordable and convenient mass transit as well is essential to ensuring that everyone can take advantage of services and opportunities. It is also, in my view, the best way to connect those with disabilities to jobs and schools and health care facilities. And that's why I can tell you today in this gathering that in a Dodd administration, never will access be an impediment to people with disabilities, regardless of where you're from and where you need to go in this country. And this needs to be a priority for all of us. This is a particularly important area, obviously, for those who live in states like New Hampshire, who live in states like Iowa, who I believe require personalized transportation support services, van services, and rideshare programs. But access isn't just about the geographic. It's also about the harnessing of the power of the Internet, which in today's increasingly global economy is absolutely critical that every American can take advantage of. From doing business to obtaining information to remaining competitive in this world, Internet technologies offer an unprecedented ability to perform tasks and employment obligations from home or anywhere else for that matter. That means that those with disabilities have access to jobs, activities, and services that might previously have been difficult to take advantage of. And that's why I will require that Internet technologies be made fully accessible to people with disabilities, including the expansion of the wireless network, to that location, rural or urban. will never be an impediment to accessing or using Internet technologies. It's the 21st century, and it's about time that our disability policy got out of the 20th century, and I believe it can do it with informed and enlightened thoughts regarding the Internet. That is also why I have been such a strong supporter of Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act.